Welcome to the latest edition of the Cranky Curmudgeon's Corner. My name is Paul Thomas, and with us on our panel tonight is Thaddeus Polhamus.
How do?
Daniel Thomas.
Hello.
And Merrick Moses.
Hola.
Since the 14th Amendment, my favorite, basically says that everybody should be treated the same, I like to see solutions to many of our problems in a mathematical context. So here is my idea for fixing the educational inequities of racial injustice. Take the wealthiest school district in all of America. By wealth, I mean the dollar amount budgeted per pupil. That dollar amount per pupil becomes the baseline for federal dollars to be given to all the other school districts until they have the same amount of dollars per pupil that the wealthiest district has. There is no racial component like affirmative action attached to the funding. It is strictly mathematical, but it would provide a tremendous financial boost to districts in communities of color. Would such a program satisfy the proponents of racial injustice in the area of education? Any other suggestions for legislation that could improve the educational system of racial inequalities? Dan, we're going to start with you.
I think that it's cute that you think that there won't be a backlash over racial lines with this idea, because while on paper it looks innocent and innocuous in that way, we've been playing a zero-sum game with public programs and funding for a very long time. And we tend to have this idea that rather than integrate the public pool, we would rather drain it and put a stop to it. And we've been doing that for years. And that metaphor does not come from me. I've been reading a book by Heather McGhee called The Sum of Us about how racism has trickled into public policy for many, many years. And I respect her a lot because she actually bothered to look up how medical assistance works in this country. So I know she does her homework. So what you're going to have with your idea, and I'm not saying that it's not inherently fair, is you're going to see what Mitch McConnell called the blue state bailout, where communities of color who are more urban centered than rural would appear to be benefiting more than the white voters, or at least that's how it would be framed. So if you're going to make this suggestion to a congressperson and the congressperson's going to get enamored with the idea, be prepared for that criticism.
But in reality, the rural districts that pay very little per pupil would benefit greatly as well.
Yes, they would.
But they're not going to say so.
No, they are not. Just like Joe Biden's current $10 trillion how much infrastructure plan that he wants to get out there, one of his initiatives is broadband internet for everyone. Mm-hmm. So that's going to include the rural communities as well as the inner cities, which are all places where no phone company wants to go and lay that wire. So these areas are cut off from the high-speed internet. We discovered very quickly over the last year how much that impacts educational inequality, because everybody went to virtual learning, but half the country can't do it because they don't have the right internet connection. Only really the suburbs have the ability to do this. That, if the infrastructure plan passes, that will equalize education for everybody a great deal. I believe there's going to be a ton of argument against it because Black people will benefit the same way white people do. So it's obviously going to be there's obviously going to be some kind of problem. And we gave away free college for decades until we started giving it to Black people. And then suddenly the student loan crisis was created, and white people are just okay with this. It's not acceptable. But as soon as we realize that people who aren't white get to participate in things, somehow they are deemed unnecessary and go away, and we drain that public pool. So you will face that criticism of your idea.
Well, no, I mean, the idea was just, it's not going to go anywhere. I'm just talking to you guys about it and to see if you have any better ideas. Merrick, what's your idea for racial equality in education?
One of the things that we need to do is reimagine school. So what could that look like? That could look like a large homeschooling component for children of color being funded by the state. It could also look like churches getting involved. There are already churches that are doing school, but like accredited schools and things of that nature. I think that racial equity in education is so important for our time, and will determine the future of our country. In that, because by 2050, most people in America will be people of color. If they are not educated, the country will continue to decline.
But so how do we get there if we're not going to fund it?
We have to fund it. So we have to fund it. So we have to fund it, and we have to fund it creatively. Like I said, the homeschooling piece, making sure that kids have the supplies that they need to go to school, not just qualified teachers, but qualified teachers that can teach small group learning, and learning how to teach in various teaching styles. That's also important. We do need the money. And also, too, using historically Black colleges and universities as anchor points for continuing the uplift of Black children through education. I think that's important too, funding the Black colleges to create initiatives that will address these inequities.
Thaddeus, what's your idea about funding education so we can achieve racial equality or racial justice?
Well, I'm going to say it's going to be a difficult thing to do for a couple of reasons. By the way, just a little sidelight, you want the richest school district in the country. And if memory serves, that would be Montgomery County, Maryland, right next to Washington, D.C. They have more money than God for education. But anyway, I think that your idea would be helpful if we could get past the fact that the lion's share of public education funding comes through local taxation right now. One of the reasons structurally that poor districts do bad and rich districts do well is that they just take it out of the local tax pot, and there are we have no overarching federal purse for the actual running of the schools. There are federal programs that help schools that come here and there, but there is not, like the National Education Fund, like the National Defense Fund. So you can't just take all the money from all the districts and redistribute it equally across the board. Because for one thing, local school boards, even some of the poorly funded ones, would balk at the idea of the federal government stepping in to fund it, because the federal government is obviously going to want to have a say in how it's done. So they don't really want the big brother in Washington to come in and dictate what kind of testing, what kind of curriculum is done. They want to do that to meet local standards and local needs. And, they haven't.
But Thaddeus, that's being done now with No Child Left Behind and Race to the Top. They were basing their funding on the test scores.
Yeah, well, what I'm saying is you're going to have a trouble getting out of that, because that is the status quo.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, it's an issue we could probably mull over all night.
Yeah, we could talk. We could spend a whole show just on education alone.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Okay, reparations is a topic that has me completely flummoxed. I fully believe America must find a way to atone for slavery, white supremacy, redlining, etc. But I don't know how to do it. If you were tasked with creating a program that dealt with the providing reparations for the legacy of slavery, Jim Crow, systems of racism, what would it look like? Thaddeus, you're in charge of making the program for reparations. What do you do?
Oh my God.
That's how I feel.
Yeah. Well, I understand why you're flummoxed. Anything that we do at any level to promote and offer opportunity to people who need it would be welcome as part of the mosaic of reparations. I mean, it would just be one part. Surely we can't sort out the heritage of slavery and subsequent racial abuse for over 50 million individuals. The debt in dollars alone with interest would probably exceed the national collective wealth. But a handout might do less than a leg up in the form of equal access to public education of standard and high quality. See the last question that we've had to walk away from.
Yeah.
The eradication of redlining practice by insurers, lenders, and the gerrymandering district planners would help as well. The most heartening toward the perception of equality without regard for ancestry or complexion are the images of children becoming friends with each other who would find their parents' reservation about it perplexing. It's morally imperative that racism cease to be taught to the next generation, and for the current adults, that's us, continuous self-examination is needed to root out the deeply embedded roots of prejudice that have become actually a subconscious second nature for a lot of us white folk.
Okay, give me an example of where racism is taught. Can you come up with one?
Where racism is taught, okay. One time when I was a student, a friend came home with me. And that friend had a really good suntan. And my parents were very, very nice to the lady. I mean, she was, welcome. And the minute she was out the door, she said, "This isn't anything serious, is it?" I was supposed to feel like, well, no, I shouldn't have any kind of a serious relationship with a person of color, should I? That was an older generation teaching a younger generation that there have to be reservations about your friendship with a person of color. And I think that's still going on.
Okay. Merrick, reparations. You're in charge with putting the program reparations together.
I believe, first of all, we definitely have to do, as you were talking about, educational reform. So what I'm looking at educational reform, schools become centers of not just learning but community activity, broadening that funding those streams, making historically black colleges and universities, job training centers, as well as education centers, equity in hiring, and we need a Marshall Plan for Black America. We need a full-on, no holds barred Marshall Plan for Black America, and there needs to be a critical race theory education as well as anti-racism education in curricula around the nation. Am I in favor of direct payment? That's a very dicey issue, right? For me, okay, so my mother was from Pittsburgh and my father was from Panama. So do I get half a check? What does that look like? And I'm not sure if direct checks are the answer, but I do know that creating situations in which Black people can buy property is very important to passing on wealth, right? And so because we haven't been able to pass along wealth for many generations in this country, I think programs of economic uplift coupled with educational uplift and a serious deep dive into these things are necessary for us to move forward.
Okay, Dan, neither Merrick or Thaddeus came up with like issuing out checks as a form of atoning with reparations. So what's your idea?
I would not be in a position where I am the one designing this program because I would have no idea where to start. I think that what
Well, let me
Merrick's
ask you this. Do you think that such a program is needed for our society to heal?
Oh yes, very much so.
Okay, good. Go from there.
But once again, what you're going to see is that the people who aren't getting it are going to be angry at the people who are, because I didn't do this, so why are my tax dollars being paid to fund this? Which is a shitty, disingenuous argument, but that is what we would hit. It's not just the African Americans who need to have the reparations, though. Chinese immigrants built our railroad system, which enabled us to have our economic booms in the industrial age of the 18th century. And many died in horrible conditions doing that, being paid significantly less than a white person. We stole the land that we built all this stuff on from the Native Americans, those who we did not wipe out. So yeah, we're basically everybody who wasn't a founding father really needs to be put into this pot. How we are going to do that, how we are going to judge it, how we are going to determine eligibility, these are questions for which I have no answers. And whatever the answers are going to wind up offending a lot of people who feel like they are being left out. To Merrick's point of rebuilding Black wealth, absolutely. And in America for the last 100 years, our homes have been our sources of wealth. That's where we invest our money. That's our biggest purchase for the normal person. I suppose if you're Jeff Bezos, then like some business is where you store your wealth. But for you, me, our houses are where that money lives. And Black people were building it up, but it was only within the last generation. And what I've come to learn about the economic crisis from 2008 was that it hit communities of color harder than it hit white communities, and it still hit white communities really hard because it was a refinancing scam. that drained the equity out of the property of everybody who refinanced because their houses were worth less than their mortgage was. So all the families who refinanced during the Big Short lost their equity in their homes. No one was ever held accountable for that. And at the end of the day, more white people had generational wealth within their family units to fall back on than people of color because they were just starting to build that up. Like maybe grandma had a house and mom has a house, but the kid doesn't have a house. Whereas in, I think, a typical middle class white family, kid has a house, their parents have a house, their grandma has a house, their great grandparents had a house. The white community was more in a position to handle that loss because we had the generational wealth built up, and the African American community and other communities of color didn't. And for years, things like Social Security didn't apply to people of color because the jobs that they didn't pay into, disproportionately did not pay into Social Security taxes, so they could not build up those retirements. They did not have jobs where there were pensions involved, 401ks. The ways that your typical middle class people build up their wealth don't exist or did not exist for a very long time for communities of color. And I guess the only way to address that injustice is to make sure that communities of color have access to those same wealth building arenas, while at the same time changing our financial laws to ensure that things like betting on shorts never happens again, which we're not going to do because we just discovered with Robinhood and GameStop that people still like betting on shorts.
Oh, really?
Mhm.
Well, it seems like none of us really have a good answer as far as reparations goes. The January 6th insurrection, from my viewpoint, was based on a single theme. The voters in places such as Milwaukee, Detroit, Philadelphia, and Atlanta should not qualify as eligible voters because they were Black and did not vote for Trump. Is there any other justification in the minds of the insurrectionists that you are aware of? Dan.
The insurrection was built on the big lie, and the big lie was built on the idea that certain groups are less American than others.
Meaning Blacks.
Blacks and people who live in cities. There's this, America has this propaganda idea that the small town rural communities are true Americans. Like if you sit down and endure any Hallmark Christmas movie, that's always what it's about. The city person goes back to the small town, falls in love, and stays there because that's real life. That's the idea that they are trying to sell you. That's the idea that Trump is trying to sell you. That the small rural community, those are the real Americans. And I got to tell you, as somebody who's lived in a city for many, many years, when I go back to that little town where I was a baby in, it's horrible to be there. I would never be willing to live there again. That's not there. They are not more American than I am because I live in a city and I have African American neighbors and I have actual Asian people who own Asian businesses here. But the idea that it's the urban area which that's coded for them, the small towns are all little and white. The big scary city, that's full of people of color, people who don't even necessarily speak English and don't even necessarily really want to because they don't have a need for it. That's un-American to them, and those people should count less in their minds. And the big lie adherents are absolutely offended that the weight of numbers of those people was enough by a very small margin to win the election and take it away from their white savior. Even though we elected another old white man, we elected the old white man that was more palatable to people who weren't other old white men, and that bothers them.
Thaddeus, the insurrection based on the racist idea that black people shouldn't be allowed to vote?
Well, I think there was a little more and in a way less to it than that. I have to retain the psychosis of the former president as a ruling factor in this. And his inability to accept defeat on any level pushed him to a point of desperation beyond our comprehension. The man who got up to the mic and cheer-led his fans into a violent frenzy wasn't just thinking about annulling the voice of black voters, which he certainly wanted to do, but he was also trying, more importantly to him, find a way to steal back the power that he was losing, and of course the legal immunity that he desperately needs now to stay out of jail. But there was no action in his mind, even a mob storming a session of Congress, that was too radical to try. The racial component of Trump's attempt to stay in office came before that, and that was in the form of endless recounts and literally scores of failed lawsuits, which specifically targeted the vote counts in racial minority heavy districts.
Which gave him the justification to go ahead and make that speech to send those people up to the Capitol.
Yeah.
The fact that those recounts needed to be done in these communities of color.
Yeah, and if they were done and they didn't come out the way he wanted, so he went to the next step, which was stage a riot.
Yeah.
But
Merrick?
I think
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I just think on January 6th, on that morning, Donald Trump was not thinking about who he wanted to disenfranchise. He wanted to change the outcome of the election so he could stay in power, and that's all he was thinking about.
Okay. Merrick, what's your take on that?
I think that it's a multifaceted beast. So we have Rump pretty much whipping these people into a frenzy, as Thad said. But then you also have the very weird marriage of evangelicals to the former president. And they really were looking at him. They actually created a theology in which Rump was the King Cyrus figure and kind of a King Cyrus / messianic figure, right? Because of his penchant for, I guess, he promised them judges and things of that nature. So until we address the religious piece, this is going to continue to happen. People are being radicalized by Christianist nationalism and racism. All of these things are going together. And I just watched a documentary. I'm watching a series called The 14th Amendment. This falls squarely in that wheelhouse, in that they don't feel that the black vote is legitimate because they don't feel that black people should be citizens, not even second-class citizens. Remember now, Roger Taney told Dred Scott that the black man has no rights that a white man is bound to respect. And that spirit permeates this country. And unless we exercise that, we're going to be in a hot situation like we are now.
Russian asset Wisconsin Senator Ron Johnson recently claimed that he had no fear of the January 6th insurrectionists because they all love their country and would never commit a crime or do anything to harm law enforcement. He also added that he would have been concerned for his safety if protesters would have been Black Lives Matter. Other Republicans have been downplaying the insurrectionists as no big deal. Is it too much of a stretch to conclude that the party of Lincoln is now the home of white supremacy and sedition? Merrick, the party of Lincoln, white supremacists, seditionists?
This is the party of white grievance, sedition, and racism. Point blank, period. They have allowed themselves to be consumed by the Borg, which is Trump's ego. And Ron Johnson is just another nut job in Congress who continues to parrot these things. Do I believe that he really felt like that? No, because if you weren't afraid of these people, why were you hiding with the rest of the senators? I mean, really, he's playing up to this racist base, but in the end, I don't think it's going to go well with him. There are a lot of people, I'm sure in Milwaukee and some of the urban areas like Madison, that are over him, and he will be canceled.
Okay, I hope you're right about that. Thaddeus.
Well, I think Mr. Johnson's comments were absolutely jaw-dropping in their bald-faced racism. A more intelligent bigot might have tried to flim-flam around such an opinion, or at least try to make some kind of an excuse for it. But he seemed to think nothing of having no fear, since the attackers of the building he was in were white. Call a spade a spade. They were white, so he wasn't afraid of them. No fear. If they had been black, he would have been afraid, maybe. And he thinks that that's all right with everybody who's within sound of his voice. Honestly, I'm just too flabbergasted to think he might as well have worn his white hood on TV.
So what about Merrick's point that he's probably going to get booted out in the 2022 election?
Oh, we can hope that the people of Wisconsin are at least not comatose and are going to do something about it on voting day.
Dan? Party of Lincoln, white supremacists and seditionists.
Well, one of my favorite criticisms of the Democratic Party is that we were the party of the KKK. And yeah, we were. That's where it came from. We switched that during the 60s, and the more hardcore of the racists, not saying that we have not completely purified ourselves, and I don't want to give that impression that that's what I think. But yeah, in the 60s, the two parties switched. The Republicans didn't like Johnson's, or the racist Democrats did not like Johnson's embrace of the Civil Rights Act, so they went and became Republicans. The Republicans used to be the Progressive Party. Now they are the opposite of that, and they find the very word to be offensive. I don't think that Lincoln would look at the modern Republican Party and see them as a competent ruling body. And while they are disproportionately represented based on population in our government, I don't think that they really have anything other. They're clinging to power in any way they can. They don't have any popular policy ideas. And as a result, they have embraced white grievance. And this country was made for Christian, heterosexual, white, cisgender men. And for so many, many years, that was all that mattered. And now that other peoples are getting a seat at the table, the white, heterosexual, Christian, cisgender men are flocking to the Republican Party because they're trying desperately to cling to that. They want to be the special ones. They want to be the ones that things were made for. And it's a gift that I'm not straight, because it could have been very easy to fall into that trap. And I can't say that I wouldn't have, but I do think that I get a bit more of an outsider's perspective, because there's one of those groups I don't fall into that lets me see things a little bit differently and with a more moral eye, I think. There's still stuff I don't think about because I have the privilege not to think about it until somebody points it out to me. But yeah, the party of Lincoln is dead. They are something totally different now. And it really bugs me when I see the Ted Cruzes and the Marco Rubios and the women and the the late great Herman Cain still somehow tweeting through his death. When I see those people ignoring the damage that is being inflicted upon their communities by these conservative ideologies, it bothers me. Thank God Milo has decided that he's not gay anymore, so that we don't have to claim him.
Oh, Milo has turned straight.
Milo has turned
Yeah.
straight. His
Yeah,
husband
he's
has
an
been
ex-gay.
downgraded to roommate, and he wants to create a giant conversion therapy church someplace where conversion therapy is banned because it's child abuse.
Okay,
Miss
thank God we're
Milo.
saved now.
Yeah, Miss Milo has been steadily bleeding cash since he basically got cut off from his college speaking tours. So this is another way. Of course, he's going to pander to the Christianist fundamentalists, and this is a way for him to get coins. This is
Yeah.
a basic craft. Like, this is a basic craft.
Deplatforming people is wonderful because then you force them to humiliate themselves for money.
Thank you for listening to our second installment of our discussion on racism and white supremacy.